Well, good evening, everyone. We're at Hope One. If you have not seen a Hope One in a while, it's because we haven't been live on Thursday nights in a little bit. And you're probably expecting to see Frank Turek here hosting the show. But we have had a lot of live broadcasts on this channel. And we wanted to get back and start something basically get it off with a bang because we have something special tonight. Now, look, a lot of times when I'm on Frank's show, I'm on as the guest and we're talking about a book or a topic. And I said, I'd love to be the one to kind of flip the table a little bit and be the host to ask you the hard questions about a book. And we just so happen to have a book we can talk about. And that's a book we're going to talk about with Frank Turek and his son, Zach, who have both written this, co-authored the book, which came out 2 days ago, Hollywood Heroes. And we're going to be inviting both of them on the screen with us here so we can all talk about this book because it's a book that is timely. And I was going to ask you this earlier, Frank, and maybe you can answer this too, Zach, that I don't think we had planned on releasing the book in May originally, and it just so happens we're one day after May 4th, that day that some people will say May the 4th be with you. And sure enough, it's just in time for us to talk about the impact of, in kind of a crazy way, of Jesus on the collective imagination of authors and screenwriters and creators over the last several decades, and really over the centuries, as they have imagined fictional characters in the image of Jesus in such a way that the actual story of Jesus can be found on the pages of fictional works in some of the most unusual places. Now, maybe you've kind of noticed and seen these kinds of parallels in fiction, but I bet you there's some areas and some characters of modern fiction that you'll be surprised. And once we kind of reveal it to you, you'll say, wow, you know what? You're right. That actually is an image of Jesus, and I hadn't quite thought of it that way. So what we're going to do tonight is talk about how Jesus is revealed to us on the pages of fiction. And then we'll also talk about why that might be the case. Like, what is it about the image of Jesus or the person of Jesus that has this kind of impact on creatives who are thinking? And why are the themes of the Jesus story reemerging over and over and over again? And how can we leverage those themes in modern creative endeavors to kind of share the gospel with others, or at least initiate conversations in which the gospel is clearer? So we're going to have time tonight to ask questions of our authors, Frank and Zach Turek, and we're also going to have time for you to ask questions. So I want you to start asking those and placing those in the chat so you have a chance to, I'll be monitoring that and we'll be asking those questions along the way. And I think you're going to see that there's probably, as we start talking about this, there are some provocative issues, even for today, given the culture we're in, the timeliness of this story, even, for example, the work of Disney and all the stuff that we'll be talking about tonight. I think you'll find some good questions that might be help you think about how Jesus has impacted culture, impacted fictional works, and how we can leverage that for the kingdom. So with that being said, let's just jump in and invite Zach and Frank. I always think of Zach first because he's nicer than Frank, but invite them both in here so we can talk about this. Now, look, guys, welcome first of all to your own show, but also
yes, thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot.
We're here. Did Jorge give you that?
He gave me this, man. It's scary. Really scary to have this.
I created a monster, Jim.
You did create a monster. I'm glad that you know what, but I want you to send me that software so I can do it for myself. Anyway, the point is, what we want to talk about tonight is your new book, which seems like it's been forever since we first started talking about the book, and since we've been anticipating the book. And I know that the kind of the supply chain crisis we've been in has slowed everyone's delivery. And so this was really something we thought would be out, I think, in February or March. And here we are now in May, finally getting it launched. But I think it is probably, in some ways, it's not, think about it. We just happened to land in that range the week of May 4th. In some ways, maybe this is meant to be. So here we are. And you've got someone else some question I want to ask you. But one of the first things I want to ask before we even start is I've started doing some work also online with my son. And the age gap between the two of us is similar to the age gap between the two of you. So I want to ask before we start, you're writing a book about the impact of Jesus and how Jesus shows up in a lot of the kind of Christ figures we talk about in fiction. We'll get more to that in a minute. But you're coming at it really from a couple of different generations. And I see this in my own life with Jimmy, that there are times when my view as a boomer is different than his as a millennial. And I wonder, as you had to watch and read a lot of fiction, watch a lot of movies in order to write this book. Tell me, did you notice that there was a difference in your perception of these characters just based on the generational differences between you and Zach?
Yeah, Zach had a better handle on the characters than I did. So go ahead, Zach. You answer that. He knows the movies inside and out. Yeah.
Well, first off, Jim, happy Revenge of the 5th, if you will. If yesterday was May the 4th, today is still a Star Wars day. So Star Wars is our favorite movie growing up. So
that's true. So congratulations. So do you think that you were more familiar with some of the movies and stories you talked about in this book?
For the modern ones, sure. I think really one of the ways that we bonded when I was a kid was the original set of Star Wars movies. And that was some of our fondest memories growing up for sure. And, Dad still thinks he's Darth Vader to this day.
I find your lack of faith disturbing. Yes.
Exactly. But moving on, as I kind of grew up, that I took that initial experience that really was kind of profound and one of the things that got me interested in cinema, and just kind of rolled with that as I grew into my teenage years and young adulthood. And then even now, I'm going to see the new Doctor Strange movie on Saturday, right? It's still something that I really enjoy.
Okay, so let's just talk about the premise of the book, though, for a second. Because for those people who maybe aren't aware, and you've got a huge fan base here that have been anticipating this book, and you've been talking about it off and on as it's been getting ready to publish. But there are a lot of people who may not even understand what there is the image of the book right here. So just tell people what the basic idea, what launched this idea. And if I'm just looking at Hollywood heroes, I might be confused as to what this is about. I like the fact, though, that it's not this obvious kind of in-your-face apologetics book in that sense, that is provocative, that when I read the cover and I look at it, I'm thinking, oh, what is this going to be about? So why don't you at least kind of give the idea, the outline of what this book attempts to do?
Yeah, so there's really two reasons why we wrote the book in general. So the first is if you look at the top selling movies of all time and look at just plain box office statistics, it really boils down to almost all of them are fictional. Even the ones like, let's say, Titanic or Gone with the Wind are actually historical fiction, right? That sets something in a time event in history and then makes everything, all the rest of it up. All the rest of it is dramatized or entirely made up. So that gets you thinking, well, why are we so interested in stories that didn't actually happen? And one of the ways that we really are, the reason why, is because we understand that something is wrong in the world and we're looking for an escape from it, right? So C.S. Lewis famously put it, is if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And we show that on a daily basis, whether it be through sports or through cinema or through literature or music or any of that, right? And so that's premise number one. And premise number two was actually an experience I had. I spent some time in the Middle East in my 20s, and I went to a movie. I went to see the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie because, I'm here. Why not go see what happens? And as I walk into this movie theater, it's full. And it's full of people who are watching a dubbed over movie, a superhero movie, basically. And I'm sitting here wondering to myself, like, why do all these other people care about this? I thought this was just an American thing. And that really kind of hit me with that kind of cross-cultural appeal that some of these movies have, because the idea that someone will come and rescue us from something, that's really a superhero genre, right? And that points directly back to Jesus, the idea that someone is going to come save us from this world that we live in. And that's really why we wrote it.
I think that's true, Jim, of just about every world religion, even people who would consider themselves atheists. I think most of us have this deep down sense that obviously there's something wrong with the world. And wouldn't it be great if somebody could come and save us from this world of pain and suffering and take us to a place where we wouldn't have it anymore? Solomon said that God has put eternity on our hearts. And that's why these movies, look, we address movies written by Christians like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, but even movies not written by Christians, by unbelievers, they can't help put in the idea that sacrifice and salvation is something beautiful. They can't help it. In fact, we go through the Avengers series. We got chapters on Iron Man and Captain America. And as we all know, in Endgame, spoiler alert, Iron Man sacrifices himself to beat Thanos and save the world. Now, that enchants everybody. But imagine if Iron Man, Tony Stark showed up at the scene with Thanos and said, to his Avenger buddies, hey, guys, you know, I'm really tired of this. I don't want to take on Thanos. I got to get back to following my heart and taking care of just me. I'm out. You guys handle it. Would anybody be enchanted by that? Would anybody go, wow, what a great story? No, we'd all go, this is ridiculous. This guy wimped out. This is not realistic. Well, it might be realistic, but it's not what we want to see. We want to see victory through sacrifice. And that's what Christianity gives us.
Yeah, good point. Now, okay, so the goal of this book, then, if I'm somebody and I'm familiar with your work, if of course I'm familiar with your work, but if I'm somebody who's just out there who reads apologetics books or who reads Christian books in general, and you're familiar with the work you've been doing for years, tell me where you see this fitting in the kind of the catalog of your work and what it is. So I know when you wrote, for example, Stealing from God, what your point, what you're trying to accomplish with that.
Yeah.
So this book, you're making great observations about the parallels between fictional accounts, both in movies and in literature, mostly movies, all Hollywood stuff, because a lot of this stuff, though, is from literature first, like the Harry Potter movies. But my point is, and that parallels to the Jesus narrative.
Yeah.
But how do you see people using this, though, in their walk with Jesus?
Well, we say on the HollywoodHeroesBook.com website, if people really want to learn more about the book, we say, imagine if there were a fun way to get your kids more interested in God. Imagine if there were a great way, an easy way to get people who are not Christians, but maybe interested in movies to consider the Christian story. So the first thing we thought about was sort of a discipleship evangelism angle, that you can use these stories in order to build a bridge to either your child or to somebody you know who normally you might not be able to build a bridge to. I mean, what do you think teenagers do when mom or dad start talking about God or they start getting the Bible out? They're like, oh, here comes another lecture, spare me, right? But if mom or dad says, hey, let's have movie night tonight, right? And then let's discuss what we saw. Okay, that's going to be a lot more fun and probably a lot more productive in some ways. Because kids might be open to a superhero that actually models an aspect of Christianity.
Yeah. Sean McDowell and I wrote a book called So the Next Generation Will Know. We talked about this idea of how do we at least be culturally sensitive enough and aware enough as parents to be able to initiate conversations that are Christian conversations, that are worldview conversations. And a lot of this will prepare us, I think, all of us to see the Christian worldview embedded in places that maybe we weren't paying attention. But that really requires us to know something about the Christian worldview to begin with. So what are the kinds of elements that you guys were looking for? In other words, the kind of broad sketch of Christianity that you were looking for in each of these movies.
Go ahead, Zach. Why don't you take that one?
Yeah, so we really tried to hit most of the main themes of Christianity, and it's not just isolated to Jesus, right? So we're not going to try to point everything directly back to Jesus, but rather the truths of the Christian worldview. So let's take Batman, for example, right? Batman really shows us human nature in a nutshell. The idea that Batman is just going to go constantly back into Gotham night in and night out. And no matter how hard he works and how much we respect him, there's still more to do in the next night, right? The idea that sin is basically undefeatable by humans is a really key theme in Batman. Or if we're talking about Captain America, the idea that we want a morally strong leader to lead us in the fight against evil, someone who, despite all of the badness that's going to come his way, is always going to get back up off of the ground and keep going, keep fighting the good fight, running the race, as Paul says. And so we try to take something unique from each one and then point back to a truth in the Christian worldview.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting. So I noticed that, look, I got a chance to preview the book very early, and I saw the list of movies. Now, what do you think about it? I kind of see it both ways. If I'm somebody who's familiar, if I've already watched all these movies, I may not have noticed the parallels that you're discovering in the book. And that's to be, it really kind of illuminates if I was to read this book after seeing all those movies. But I think there's an advantage, like you have a list of all the movies that could be watched. This book I see has value whether you have seen those movies or not. It almost, though, kind of gives me a roadmap of like what movies ought I watch to kind of see some of this imaging of Jesus that you talk about. So I see the book both ways. It's kind of a before or an after book.
Yeah, in fact, our mutual friend Natasha Crane, who endorsed the book as well, when she read the book, she had only seen one of the 40 movies that we say you might want to look at to know this book better. But she said, I didn't even need to see the movies because I could follow what you were saying by just reading the chapters, and I love the book. So It's a fun book. It's more fun than just an average apologetics book because you're visualizing things you've seen. And we can address the biggest issues in Christianity in this book. We address creation. We, of course, address Jesus and his deity, because the last chapter is the ultimate hero. Jesus is the ultimate hero. We address the resurrection, of course. We address the problem of evil. All of these things come up in the course of the movies.
Right.
And so it's easy to just segue into these issues and point out even the power of weakness when you look at Lord of the Rings, right? That these movies are so rich in moral lessons for kids and even theological lessons that it was pretty easy to write, actually.
Okay, so let's talk about how you selected the series you did, and I think you pretty much captured a lot of the series that I would have thought of as well. But how did you guys decide? I mean, there probably are some things you could have covered also that you decided were just going to be outside your scope, or you kind of. So how did you pick the series you did?
Yeah, we had some space issues, obviously. I mean, with a subject matter as rich as this is, some things get left on the cutting floor. Like, hey, we thought about writing a chapter about Thor. He didn't make the cut. Maybe if we do Hollywood Heroes 2, he's next on the list. But that initial listing of movies I mentioned, right, was really something that we focused on. We wanted to take something that was popular. We wanted to take something that had cross-cultural appeal. And we wanted to take something that had positive examples of Christian ideas, right? Each of these things has something bad in them, right? Bad, we say you can't have a good story without sin in it. Conflict requires sin in order to be resolved. If the movie started with and they all lived happily ever after and no one did anything wrong, there's nowhere to go with that. But we wanted to take something that had a positive idea that we could build off of in a way that was meaningful for you to connect with people.
Okay, so here are the series, at least the chapter series of the different movies you took a look at. Captain America, Iron Man. Now, I'm going to mention these, and for the people who are listening, maybe you aren't familiar with the book yet, I wonder if a couple of these will raise eyebrows.
Yeah.
Especially for people who maybe have had a more very conservative view of what it is where they're going to allow. And look, we're in a generation right now where it seems like this is a hot topic, right? What the role that parents play in determining content for their kids or determining what brands they're going to advance. So we've got Captain America, Iron Man, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Batman, Wonder Woman. And then you talked the last chapter about what these all point to. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, okay, those all make sense. And I can see immediately, because I've also written about, Christ figures in literature. I can see already how I would kind of mine that stuff out too. But I just can't help but wonder how much pushback you've received, or at least you thought about, related to the Harry Potter series, for example, right? Because so much, I mean, there's lots of places where you and I speak around the country that if we just said, hey, we're writing a book about the parallels between Harry Potter and Jesus, a lot of people would say, really?
Yeah.
Well, they would almost discount it right away. So I was kind of glad to see, number one, that you put it right in the middle of your grouping. So you kind of introduced the topic. I wonder if you had made that chapter 1, how many people would have stumbled on it, or for whatever reason.
Right. Well, first of all, I respect whatever parents decide for their kids, right? I think parents ought to be in control of what their kids see and hear. And if for some reason they think Harry Potter's out of bounds, okay, it's out of bounds. However, I have discovered, and I think Zach can talk more about this as well, that Christians have not been consistent on this issue. Because the wizardry, first of all, the wizardry in the Harry Potter series is not the kind of wizardry or occult that the Bible talks about, okay? This is totally invented stuff from J.K. Rowling's head. But secondly, people have been inconsistent, because they say you can't watch Harry Potter, but you can watch Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia. And they had wizardry in them as well. I mean, Gandalf is a wizard. That's what he does. So why do we have this kind of double standard where we're going to say Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia is okay? Well, they were written by Christians, but Harry Potter isn't. Well, newsflash, according to J.K. Rowling's own testimony, she is a Christian. And in fact, as we point out in the book, she says the entire series can be epitomized by 2 Bible verses. One is from 1 Corinthians 15, which says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And the second is from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. She says, they can epitomize the entire series, but I never wanted to talk about really the biblical backbone of this series because I didn't want readers to know where they were going, where we were going, where I was going with the whole story. Now, Zach points out that there are actually 4 explicit parallels, and we point this out in the book, from Harry Potter to Jesus. Zach, why don't you pick that up there and take that, because that's so interesting.
Yeah, and Zach, I want to ask you to do this for every single chapter, because I want to reserve some of this. It's a great book, and I want people to discover it. And I know when you're flying at 30,000 feet, sometimes you can't really cover all this in that kind of detail anyway. But I would like you to at least talk about this issue with Harry Potter. There are parallels. Let's describe them.
Yeah, and there's big ones. In fact, I would say of all of the books that we covered, all the series of movies that we cover, Harry Potter is actually the best example we have of Jesus, probably in modern literature, probably since Aslan from the Chronicles of Narnia. And so there's really 4 ways in which we see that. So number 1 is Harry Potter's coming is prophetically foretold. So we don't learn this until later in the books, but there's a prophecy that is spoken about Harry Potter that basically states that he is going to be the one to save us from Voldemort, who's the big baddie, if you will, in Harry Potter's world. The evil wizard that Harry Potter is fighting against basically the whole series. Number 2 is that Harry Potter lives a morally upright and virtuous life. He's not perfect, obviously, but especially when the cards are on the table, he makes the right choice, even when it costs him. Right. And so by living this virtuous life, he comes and shows us an example of, again, going back to the hero vibe, what we want to see in a hero. Right. The third is that Harry Potter walks willingly to his death. So we find out late in the series that actually the way that
spoiler alert again,
right? Is that Harry Potter has to sacrifice himself in order to defeat Voldemort. And not only does he understand that, he walks to death's door willingly. And the last is, obviously, he resurrects after he is killed, right? And so Harry Potter, just like Jesus, is actually directly called in the series the master of death. The idea that death at the end no longer has power over him. That doesn't mean that he's not going to die eventually, but this idea that Voldemort, who's the exemplar of death in the series, is overcome by Harry, and he is then the master of death.
And it's interesting too, Jim, at the end of this, Harry dons his invisibility cloak, right? And he's inspiring his followers to believe in him so they can defeat Voldemort, the Satan figure. What does that sound like?
Yeah,
that's it. He's invisible. He's the spirit behind all this. I mean, if you really and what Zach pointed out in the beginning, when Harry Potter was prophesied before he was born, Voldemort, the Satan figure, tries to kill Harry as an infant. What does that make you think of? You know, Herod trying to kill the baby. I mean, she took this right out of the Bible.
Okay, but that's a good point, though. So she's telling you, she's in interviews, she's saying that this is really what inspires her, that this is kind of, and she didn't want to give that away because then you would know the trajectory, the overarching trajectory of the plot. So I get that. Now, that's not true, though, probably for everyone who you've mentioned in the screenplay in these movies series. I mean, you've got one who's telling you that, yeah, that was what inspired her, what kind of laid the outline for her stories, all of that. But that's not always true. So when you see the image of Jesus, the nature of Jesus reflected in these movies, how do we explain it? I mean, it's one thing to say, yes, I was consciously, like Lord of the Rings, or I was, there's several authors and writers who are so inspired by the gospel story that they just decide, I want to recast it. So that's one thing. But there's some folks who don't even probably even recognize the fact that they're recasting it. So what do you think is the cause of these other similarities?
Well, I think Hollywood can't help copying from God, because, as I said earlier, I just think that this idea is ingrained in all of us, whether we're Christians or not, that we want to be taken from this world. That's our deepest desire. We want to escape pain and suffering, and we're enchanted by stories where someone takes us to that new world. Now, that's exactly what Jesus began to accomplish with his sacrifice, and of course, he's going to complete that when he comes back. But even people, as I mentioned earlier, who are not Christians and might not even know much about the Christian story, they can't help put that in to something that they're trying to do from an art perspective because they know it resonates with people.
Okay, so wait a minute. So let's talk about this first. So are you saying they can't help but put that in? Are you arguing this is because we're all designed in the image of our creator, and so the story is part of the embedded image, or are we saying that they're familiar with the story because they're in Western culture, and because they're familiar with it, it's kind of a theme that resonates, or how do we explain why we find it over and over and over again?
Well, those might be a couple of reasons, but I think the main reason is because we live in God's world, and reality is structured in such a way that we know it's beautiful when somebody sacrifices himself to save somebody else. And we also all know, regardless of our worldview, even atheists will admit there's something wrong with the world. Well, if there's something wrong with the world, we have a desire to fix it. Well, we can't fix it ourselves. We're fallen human beings. Someone has to come rescue us. All these superhero movies, there's some outside force that comes in and rescues these people and takes them to the promised land. Well, that's ultimately what Jesus does.
And to build on that, how do you fix it? Right? We can't come up with a better solution than someone coming to save us, not by anything that we've done, not by any virtue of our goodness or greatness, but because it's the right thing to do. And again, who does that point back to?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we would say this then: a book like this, and I come to something similar in Person of Interest, where I see that there's evidence in here. There's something here that's worth chasing from an evidential perspective. But the question is it? I guess how strong is this evidence for Jesus? There's a way in which I look at it and say, no, it's a piece of the cumulative case of this nature of reality that points to one story above all. But let me just play a little. First of all, let me just read to you. These are the attributes that I kind of seen classically identified as Christ figuring. Now, this is a genre of literature that is not always. You don't see parallels to this usually outside of this. It's this expression, for example, this term is unique, right, to Jesus and the way that he has been reimagined in fiction. So here's what you see. These are the kinds of attributes you see of characters that are Christ figures. Number one usually has a virtuous mother or a divine or a royal father. Now, as I'm saying these, you can think about all the characters you've written about in your book. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of see that this is common to many of these characters. Was born mysteriously and appears, at least early on, to be poor, possesses some form of dual identity, right? Mm-hmm. One that is common, the other that's special in some way, has an oddly unknown childhood and is later either misunderstood or considered crazy, provides hope to others and has miraculous supernatural powers, behaves in an extremely moral manner. You already said this, Zach, about one of the characters, and as either or could be celibate, for example, as part of the narrative. Cares for people who are poor, who are distressed, who are hungry, sees truth that is hidden from others or hidden to others, and is associated with light in some way. You see this, for example, in a lot of the superhero early Superman movies. Yeah. Interacts with and is tempted by the devil or an evil force, as you described in the Harry Potter movies, is punished or dies unjustly for his claims, usually connected to love or to truth in some way, is betrayed by a close friend. A close friend is denied by those who knew him, is depicted at some point with his arms spread. You see that in some of the Superman movies, like a cross, and is reborn in some way, either physically or spiritually or emotionally. Sometimes it's really subtle. But the point is that overarching kind of description, you find this in many characters. And it's not just you find one aspect. Usually you find them clustered in this way. And that's when you start to realize, well, so either the person writing it, like Rowling, is somebody who is intentionally, is familiar with the story and is intentionally trying to recraft it, or it's the other situation where maybe it's so embedded. Now, let's play a little devil's advocate, okay? And either one of you can answer this question. So the atheist in me says, and this is what I would have said before as a non-believer, well, yeah, duh, there is something about this. There is something about, as an evolved creature, I sense my own mortality. I sense my own fragility in a world in which there are lots of creatures that can eat me. So I have a sense that I am in need of protection. I sense my own vulnerabilities. Couldn't all of these attributes of the arching story of how I solved this dilemma, couldn't they come to me by natural means? In other words, because we've all shared that genealogy, we all share that timeline. we all end up with the same kinds of concerns. If we may perhaps had been the biggest, most ferocious animal in the world, maybe we wouldn't have had concerns of needing to be saved. Maybe there wouldn't be as much perceived as wrong with the world. Couldn't I argue that this is part of an evolutionary process? And then, so that's why there's lots of these stories. They're all similar because Jesus is just another in a cluster of stories that come out of that evolutionary process.
Well, you could argue that. Now, I need to be clear, so most the people out there watching know that our main argument that Christianity is true is not because there are Christ figures all over the place. That's the, you know, this book is not saying that because these movies, you know, have all these Christ figures, Christianity must be true. That's not our point. But what we are saying is that if Christianity is true, you would expect this kind of thing to be mimicked over and over again. Now, I'm curious, Jim, because your book, Person of Interest, is an amazing piece of research and a fun read as well. As you researched all of these Christ figures, first of all, I know were they before Christianity, after Christianity? Were most of them? What were the commonalities other than what you mentioned already that you had between these Christ figures, and why do you think so many of them have come up?
Well, those specific ones I listed for you, I think those you're going to see those in their most robust form post Jesus. That's why I think they're important. You get less of those, and they're much more broad in the kind of dying and rising mythologies that might exist from antiquity. As a matter of fact, people typically try to craft them or restate them in a way that makes them sound much more similar to the Jesus story than they actually are in reality. They just have overarching common expectations of ancient people groups, but we do have certain common expectations. But then to get into the nuts and bolts of the Jesus story, which you guys then see again over and over again in movies, that is really post Jesus. You cannot get there. For example, no one is looking at these characters and saying, you know, this reminds me of the Osiris story. Oh, this reminds me of the story of Buddha. No, because it turns out they're so specific to the Jesus story that genre of literature, Christ figures, is appropriately, it's an appropriate term. Right, because they don't end up being that much like Osiris or like Attis or like whoever it is you think that is the copycat, you know, mythology, which to me, we kind of debunked that in that book as well. But the point is, I think they are specific, and that's what's interesting to me, is that maybe it's just a matter of, like you said, you know, this is not a proof for Jesus, but it may be a good reflection of the kind of deep impact he's had on the imagination of the West, of anything that fall. And when I say the West, what I really just simply mean is every human being that follows Jesus on the timeline is so deeply impacted by the Jesus story. And now, like you said, Zach, you could be in the Middle East. These ideas about a savior that are embedded in movies are international. They travel across borders because the technology is available to us now to push them out to the whole world. So I do think that there's something in this, and there also are themes. And I want to move to that for a second, because I thought one of the things you talked about in one of the characters related to the books, and I'm interested in this generation, Zach, and I'm going to ask you this question too, because I talked to Jimmy about this a lot. I think we are in the identity generation. I'm not even sure that people are making decisions on the basis of much more than do they want to wear the T-shirt. In other words, we are getting to a place where I'm not sure many people are examining evidence for anything, but they are instead saying, do I want to be identified as that? Is there something about that I find attractive? What I love about your book is that you're showing that all the stuff that non-believers find to be attractive, that they write into superhero movies, are grounded in the story of Jesus. He's so attractive that he is reimagined over and over and over again. But you do discuss identity specifically in the story of Ironman, identity and purpose. And that's where I want to just kind of drill down a little bit. So what is it about the Ironman story that helps us, especially those of us who might be struggling with the role of identity in our own lives or the role of purpose for our own lives?
Yeah, so purpose is really kind of one of the main themes in Iron Man. And first off, Marvel got the casting of Iron Man down pat because Robert Downey Jr. is probably the best cast actor in a role, I would say, probably since Harrison Ford was cast as Han Solo in the Star Wars movies. I mean, he literally just fits the bill. In fact, most of Iron Man's story actually mirrors Robert Downey Jr.'s own life pretty well, actually. And we write about that in the book, and we'll cover it here. But as the story goes along, what we see is in the first Iron Man movie, Tony Stark has everything the world would tell us that we want, right? He has money, he has power, he has women, he's got everything he wants. He doesn't have to answer to anyone. And he finds that as the movie goes on, really, he has no purpose in his life. And this is really a theme that's kind of explored over the subsequent Iron Man movies, is him trying to discover his purpose. When he first becomes Iron Man, he's still in it for himself, right? He's selfish. In fact, he's one of the few characters in all the superhero genre to unmask himself, because he wants the world to know that he's Iron Man. Why? Not because he has some, altruistic motive, but because he wants you to know how cool he is. And then as he moves throughout the movies, he starts to become more selfless as he begins to acquire a purpose, to understand what his role in the world is going to be, and then realize that there are parts of his life that need to be fixed. And in the end, ultimately, that there are things that are in his life that are worth dying and sacrificing for, right? So he starts off, he's a womanizer, he's an alcoholic. And as he moves throughout the movie, right, he begins to have a serious girlfriend, and they wind up getting married, and they have a child. And as he's starting to become a part of this team that is the Avengers, he's not just in it for himself and for the popularity contest. All of a sudden, by the end, he's one of the leaders of the group, and he's the one that everyone looks to, that when all of the marbles are out on the table, that he's the one that has to save the day and snap his fingers and sacrifice himself. And that's a huge shift from where we find him at the beginning, right? If those two characters could meet each other, they look at each other like they didn't even know him. And how does that come? Because he has a purpose by the end. And that's something that Christianity can give us too, right? It's purpose. The idea that there's something to live and something, if we have to, worth dying for.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that it's not the opposite trajectory? In other words, isn't it interesting that the movie doesn't start like the goal is not to end up with all the stuff he starts with? It could have been the whole goal of his life, is to come out of poverty and rise to this level of prestige on the basis of inventive ability. It could have been like an Elon Musk kind of story, right? But I mean, the reality of this is it's making, what is it about our nature that, do you have any sense or any reason to believe that the creators of that series, or of any of those series that kind of blend all these Avengers together, are stealing consciously from the Jesus story?
It just depends. I think Stan Lee, who's one of the creators of Iron Man, actually did not design him to be any type of Jesus figure. He actually designed Iron Man. If you actually go back and read why he wrote it, he designed him to kind of be this bombastic post-Vietnam weapons and arms dealer, because he thought it would tick people off, right? And then to make a hero out of someone like that was just kind of something he thought was really interesting. But again, kind of going back to this theme, right? As you look at the genre itself, what keeps coming back over and over again is characters that sell, characters that do well, because ultimately, again, look at the movies, who's paying to see what? Characters that do well cannot help but have motives or be a part of sacrificial actions that appeal to us, because that is what we want to see.
Jim, I think one of the greatest biblical lessons comes from Iron Man. And I don't think it was intentional. I just think it works out that way, because the world right now tells you to follow your heart. But Tony's following his heart early on in his life. His company sells weapons to a terrorist, and one of those weapons blows up near him and puts shrapnel in his chest. Then he has to have a device put in his chest to guard his heart from approaching shrapnel. Well, in order for Tony to live, he has to guard his heart. Well, that's what the Bible says. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, I'll emphasize it again, above all else, guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. The culture says follow your heart. Well, that's what Tony's been doing up to this point. He's been following his heart, and he's still miserable. He has everything to live with, but nothing to live for. Once he starts guarding his heart, and he's not so impulsive anymore, then he can focus on what's really important, and he ultimately gets to the point where he sacrifices himself to save the world. So the guard your heart command is visually represented right in the chest of Iron Man. And I don't think they intended that. I just think it works out so beautifully.
Okay, so see that conversation you just had, that's a picture of the kinds of conversations we can have with our kids.
Yeah.
If we just know enough, number one, about what's true from scripture.
Mhm.
And then two, are familiar with the movies that end up, because you start to observe these things even when they're not explicit.
Right.
Right. You start to observe and you start to pull these things out of the movies. And that's what I think makes them so, that's why I think this book is so powerful. But so just let me give you another devil's advocate here a little bit. So are we just now searching for anything? Because I would have said, look, the scriptures are going to have something of value. I was not a believer, but I would have said, look, if ancient people groups are observing human nature long enough, they will observe things that are true. And then they will write those things down. This is just basically the product of ancient collective wisdom, not necessarily from the divine mind. But I would still have been interested in ancient wisdom from the collective experience of lots of ancient people groups. And so then are we just doing the same thing we're seeing now? Well, they noticed things 2,000 years ago, so we happen to still continue to notice these things. But I think there's more at work here. It's yes, I mean, you're finding the parallels of heroism, of heroic actions. And there are heroic actions that are similar to the heroic actions of scripture. But I can't help but wonder if some of this isn't seeded divinely, so that it always emerges anytime we tell any story. But did you discover something in seeing these patterns? Because I think the more you see a pattern, the more it has to be explained.
Yeah, well, one question that we always get is, what is the one common theme that runs through all the superheroes? Virtually all of them. It's sacrifice. That's it. They have to sacrifice something that's dear to them in order to save people. Even Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is like Iron Man, where Wonder Woman doesn't follow her heart. In the movie, the two movies she's been in three, but the two centered around her. In the last one she was in, she had to deny her heart's desire with her loved one, her boyfriend, Steve. She had to let him go because she had to follow the truth. And if she didn't follow the truth, she couldn't save anyone. She couldn't save the world. So she said, I got to follow the truth, not my heart. Now, I mean, that's so countercultural today, but that's what Wonder Woman's doing. Now, if she had just followed her heart selfishly, that would not be an interesting story, right? Nobody would go, wow, that's really inspiring. I'm enchanted by this person being so selfish that they're just doing whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it. We go, come on, that's not reality. That's not heroic. Even if you're an atheist, you're going to recognize it's not heroic.
So, Zach, do you think it's that we're simply inspired by these things that are trickled down to us in our Western culture, and they come from biblical narratives? Or is there something innately inspiring? Or is it just perhaps that we are inspired today by the same things the ancients were inspired about? So when they wrote fiction, Jesus, 2,000 years ago, it kind of resembles the fiction we write today, because that's what I would have said as an atheist. Or is there some better way to explain it?
I would say, there's part of that we can't avoid, that there could be an argument made that, oh, well, this is just Western thought taking us to its inevitable conclusion. But one thing I would say is that there are parts of many of these heroes that are counterintuitive, particularly as it pertains to kind of your earlier example of, well, is this just evolutionary biology? And so the example I would use there is actually from the Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien is just a master. He is such a wonderful storyteller, and the ideas that come out through Lord of the Rings, if you really stop to pause and think about it, are just so powerful that it's even hard to express. I mean, there's books written about this stuff, right? We're just trying to cover it in a chapter, right? Yeah. But the theme for Lord of the Rings that I'll talk about is weakness, right? So the idea that the central character of your heroic story is the hobbits, if you will, right? So they are the weakest, they are the shortest, they are not particularly intelligent, they really never quite figure out what's going on around them. And then this pair of hobbits, Frodo and Sam, is in charge of the most important mission of the entire thing. And how do they do it? Well, they bungle their way all the way through. They need help from all the stronger characters. And then by the time they get there to Mount Doom, Frodo actually fails in his mission. He claims the ring for himself.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so who steps in to save the day? Well, actually, it's the character all along that we were hoping was killed, Gollum. right?
Mhm.
The annoying one, the guy that keeps coming back because he wants
My
the ring.
precious.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
wants his precious, right? And
Yeah.
actually, mercy is what saves the day. A very counterintuitive idea in Western culture, right? So this idea that there is
Mhm.
power and weakness and mercy again shows back, and we just love this.
Yeah.
We can't get enough of it, right? And then who ends up saving the day? And as Gollum bites the ring off and flails into the pit of Mount Doom, the only plausible explanation for that sequence of events is what we would have called in the Middle Ages providence, right? The idea that there is a good force at work pushing us towards the conclusion that we want, because nothing else makes sense. That it is so unlikely that any of these events could have added up to this conclusion that it has to be a force working for good in the world.
Great, great. Now, we're getting to a point where I want to make sure we include people who are asking
Yeah,
questions
get some
online. We've got a
questions,
few
yeah.
of those queued up,
Mhm.
so I want to make sure
Okay.
we get those before we run out of
Mhm.
time. So I'm just going to take these kind of not necessarily in the order in which I get them. Okay, let's talk about that. This has been asked, and so you had to make some choices about what you were going to include and what you weren't going to include. Did you consider looking at singles, not just series? I think are better because they develop characters over time, over several movies. But did you look at any, like, for example, they've asked about the Prince of Egypt. Now, clearly that's a biblical narrative. So, I mean, did you look at any of the biblical retellings of stories, or did you say, no, we want to stay away from those explicit retellings of biblical stories?
For this book in particular, that was not really a genre that we had considered. We could certainly do something like that in the future. I think the problem with movies like The Prince of Egypt is that it's so fictionalized in a lot of ways that
Yeah.
it's hard to really make the case that the person that you see in that movie is actually as similar as we think he is to the character in the Bible. Now,
Mhm.
there's maybe he is, but you take even the Ten Commandments, the movie that we all grew up watching. Well, so much of
You're right.
even the dialogue in that movie
Yeah.
is just made up out of nowhere, and maybe something like that happens. But you're taking what might be a couple of verses in the Bible and trying to extrapolate from there what a character is like, and that's tough to
Even
do.
The Chosen.
I didn't want to bring The
Is-
Chosen up because I wasn't sure that was something that was within the
Yeah.
kind of genre of the things you were looking at. Because again, you're
Mhm.
not looking at necessarily things that are explicit
Yeah, we're
retellings
not.
of Scripture.
We're not.
This book is
Mhm.
about the stuff that all of you have watched.
Right.
I guarantee you, I don't, unless you're Natasha Crane, you've probably seen more than one
Mhm.
of these movies and with your kids or without your kids. So what's great about this is you're going to right away, like light bulbs are going to go on when you read this book. And I think that's interesting to me because it means you have just now, someone's just giving you a step stool to a conversation.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's talk about this for a second. I've always thought about this too. Someone's asking about the Force in Star Wars, and I've always kind of questioned that myself. Like, there's some parts about Star Wars I love, but there's also some distortions. You can be misled if you try to draw too many tight parallels between aspects of Star Wars and aspects of the Christian worldview. So the question is, would you describe something like the Force in Star Wars as more like Christ consciousness as described by Rohr? So we've got progressive Christians who, again, can take different ideas. And I often wonder if some of the more progressive Christian thinkers are really adopting cultural ideas rather than biblical ideas. How would you see that relationship between the Force and Star Wars? Where do you see it fitting or not fitting in to a Christian worldview?
You'll take this one, Dad?
Oh, you got it. You know Star Wars better than I do, man.
Yeah, so I would say, Richard Rohr makes an interesting point, but I don't think that's the point of the Force. So the Force, if you look at how it's laid out in the movies, is actually morally neutral. So the idea that you would ascribe that to some type of consciousness, particularly a Christ-centered consciousness, doesn't really make sense to me, right? So the Force is something that can be accessed by both sides. It doesn't take sides. And the whole point behind Star Wars, if you actually go back and talk and look at what George Lucas says, is Star Wars is a morality play at its heart, right? It's actually space opera. That's the genre that Lucas calls it. And so we have these big cascading light and dark sides, right? And it's very obvious what path each character is going down. And we as an audience are left to decide what's right or wrong, but we clearly are biased towards the light side. But the Force itself is not, right? And in many ways, actually, the dark side characters are often more powerful as an example, right? You have this big menacing Darth Vader who all of a sudden is going up against this, puny little Luke Skywalker who's not even a Jedi yet, right? So obviously there's no Christ conscious when Darth Vader is using the Force to do evil. And so go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in fact, the point of Lucas, as Zach just said, is that this is not a personal force; it's an impersonal force. So there's no consciousness going on. It's just an impersonal force. And the interesting thing, Zach, maybe you could describe the physical manifestation of being on the dark side or the light side with these characters, because I found that interesting. This is in Hollywood Heroes as well.
Yeah, so it's actually something that the Master Yoda says in the new. Not the new trilogy, the prequel trilogy. So the second set of 3 movies, since we can't do things in chronological
Isn't that the
order.
isn't that the most popular of the 3 sets of trilogies?
Actually,
most vilified or demonized.
Probably depends on which ones you saw first. But either way,
I guess that's true. I guess
Yoda in the prequel trilogy defines the path to the dark side, right? So fear, anger, hate, suffering, and that is the path that we see as an example Anakin Skywalker follow.
Right.
In the prequel trilogy. And what happens as he moves further and further down the path to the dark side? You see physical deformity, right? So he starts off as a whole kid. He's all Humpty-Dory. In the second movie, he gets his arm cut off. In the third movie, you see as he walks further and further down, his eyes start to change, right? And then all of a sudden, he gets all of his limbs lopped off after his real fall to the dark side. And then by the time the prequel trilogy is done, it's Darth Vader. And he is encased in a suit of armor that is all black, and he has a red lightsaber, and that is like full Star Wars imagery, right? He is as dark as he can be, or the Emperor Palpatine, right? By the time he's fully revealed, he has all this facial deformity, his eyes are all sunken, and he looks like he's literally dying on the inside because he's so evil.
And the folks on the light side are attractive. They're pretty. There's nothing wrong with them. Meanwhile, Darth Vader's like half man, half breathing machine, right?
So, well, it's a moral story. So do you think that there's an overt effort there on the part of the screenwriters to discuss the nature of sin? Because you really see it in that transition. From Anakin to,
Absolutely. And George Lucas is upfront about this, right? I mean, when he says Star Wars is a morality play, he's trying to get us to ask what we would call as Christians life's big questions, right? What am I here for? What am I doing? What's the meaning of my life? And he's challenging us to at least think about that. Now he says, hey, I'm not trying to make the Force a religion. He explicitly says that, although, some Christians think that he might be trying to push it down our throats. But he's trying to say, I don't care what your answer is. I just want you to think about it. That's the whole point of the movie.
Okay. So is your sense then, so as people watch this and they can draw these parallels out about the nature of good and evil, about the nature of sin, about the nature of a life after this one. Do you see how I'm a parent and I'm watching this. How can I leverage this? How can I leverage it tomorrow? Because like you said, there's another superhero movie coming out this weekend.
Yeah, we have questions in the back of each chapter that will help have a family discussion. You can use these questions to do that. And I think, obviously, some of these questions you can just look at the movies and go, well, why do we think Darth Vader's the bad guy and Luke Skywalker is the good guy? Why? Why we have this sense of right and wrong written on our hearts, right? And where does that come from? If we have a moral law written on our hearts, there must be a moral law giver, right?
Right.
Why did Anakin become Darth Vader? Because he was lured into it by his own desires. Well, that's what James talks about, right? James, the half brother of Jesus, says you get lured into this. In fact, he uses a word that means he uses the word enticed. And in that context, it means to be actually lured by bait, as if you were baited into a trap. And so you could use these biblical concepts, or you could use the movies, I should say, to support biblical concepts. And it's more fun than just saying, well, let's see what the Bible says. You have to do that as well. Sure. But this is a more fun way of making the same point that kids might go, oh yeah, look at that. I didn't notice that until now.
Okay. Go ahead.
Just real quick. So as an example of this, I think the real idea that we're trying to, particularly if you're a parent, to engender here is that we can't always look for the negatives in the movies, because there are plenty, right? When you start to look at examples of bad behavior or stuff like that, you're going to find that in any movie that you watch. So Star Wars, as an example, growing up, I saw all of the Christian apologetic literature about Star Wars. The idea that the Force was pantheistic in nature, which in some ways it is, right? So I see all these negative examples of bad theology in Star Wars. But when you think about it, again, going back to Lucas's point, Star Wars isn't a theological movie, right? Lucas isn't trying to convert you to Buddhism in it, despite the fact that it might have some Buddhist themes. But there's a way of talking about it positively as well. And so we need to talk about the negative because, as parents, as Dad mentioned, right, you still have to shelter your kids from some things. But we can't just look at the movie and think, oh, well, here's all the things that's wrong with it. Because I didn't really have an intellectual conversation about what was good about Star Wars until I was in my 30s.
Right.
And there could have been so much more earlier on in my life that we could have talked about that was going to give me some more stable ground to stand on. When you say, oh, well, think about sacrifice this way, when Luke is willing to sacrifice himself for his father. I never even thought about that.
Let me say a couple of quick things about that, though, too, Jim, because I think this is really important, because a lot of Christians will say, oh, we got to separate. We can't deal with any of this evil. We can't let no unclean thing before our eyes. Well, if you want to take that literally, you can't even read the Bible, okay? Because there's a lot of bad stuff in the Bible. And in fact, Paul even says in both 1 Corinthians 10 and in Romans 15 that the evil that you see in the Old Testament are in the Old Testament and they really happen, but they're examples for us to help us not do what they did, right? But if you couldn't read about evil, you couldn't even read the Bible. Secondly, Jesus used stories that weren't true, meaning there was no good Samaritan. Like you would say, well, where's this guy? What's his real name? No, he's making a story up to make a moral or theological point. And that's what movies can do. Now, sometimes they make bad theological or moral points, but when they make good theological or moral points, we ought to be able to use them.
So you're saying that basically Jesus was one of the first, or was the very first screenwriter in some sense.
Parables,
word pictures. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me just, two things I see out of this as I'm listening to you. Number one, look, I'm an apologist, but I wasn't always an apologist. I mean, I was a parent before I was a Christian parent, and I was a Christian parent before I was a Christian parent who's an apologist. Looking back at the years, my kids were like 8. Jimmy was 8, I think, when I became a Christian. So I could look at that and say, okay, so I made a lot of mistakes before we got to the age of 8. Did you guys, when you were growing up, Zach, did you find that you guys had these kinds of conversations? After all, you're being raised by an apologist. Did he leverage these movies to teach you Christian worldview?
Not in this way. I mean, we certainly had a whole ton of theological conversations growing up, and you throw the odd reference in there once in a while, and you take maybe more of the popular Christian novels like Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia. But by and large, those two parts of my life were separate. If I wanted to go see one of these movies, I had to prove that it was worth seeing, basically, as opposed to the other way around. And that was a pretty common thing for most of my friends too. And that still should be something that you need to do as parents, right? Again, going back to the whole parenting thing, we're not trying to tell you how to parent. We're just trying to offer some suggestions of, if your kids are into this sort of thing, it's not all bad, right? Actually, in many ways, there's more bad than good in a lot of scenarios, as long as they're willing to sit down and think about it.
Now, I did notice that, well, by the way, who'd you have to prove this to, by the way? You had to make a case for what was it? I'm thinking it wasn't your dad. Okay. I'm thinking it was your mom.
It was mom in most cases, but
Yeah,
dad
that's what
too.
I thought. Yeah. Okay. So I noticed, though, you did mention Chronicles of Narnia. Now, that's not one that you mentioned it a couple of times in the book, really when referencing aspects of Lord of the Rings or characters in Lord of the Rings. But you didn't pick up on. Now, look, I suppose you clearly, it's a reimaging of the Jesus story, but it's kind of like Lord of the Rings, in the sense that it's written by someone from a Christian worldview who's writing fantasy. So why did you not include either Space Trilogy or the Lord of the Rings, or the Chronicles of Narnia, rather, from C.S. Lewis?
Two reasons. Number one is that the Narnia movies were not particularly successful. And then the second is they're actually radically different in their approach to storytelling. So Chronicles of Narnia, for those of you that haven't read it, is basically Christian allegory. So as Jim said, right, it's almost a one-for-one reimagining. They just fictionalize some of the main characters, right? But there is very little room left for interpretation of who Aslan, as an example, is. He's the Jesus figure. So there's not much to write about in the lens of the subject of the book on the Chronicles of Narnia. Whereas then the Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that, as Tolkien mentions, it is a Catholic or Christian work, because of that, he actually removes intentionally almost every single overt reference to Christianity in the book. So the story does the telling, as opposed to there being some direct reference. It's Christian. Tolkien probably would have described it as Christian myth versus Christian allegory.
Okay,
You know, Jim, I was going to say we didn't want either to use stories that were so direct, like Zach said. What we preferred was to use stories in real popular movies that everybody would have seen, and say, you know, your friend might not go see Chronicles of Narnia, but I bet he's seen Ironman. So why don't we use that, or Harry Potter or something?
So Zach, let me ask you. I know we're getting close to the end here, but I just want to ask a couple questions. I'm thinking about as a parent. If someone said, "Okay, look, I get it. There's stories here that we can leverage. There's some truth claims that we can contrast always does provide us with opportunities to talk about what's true. It's almost always when you're comparing what's true to what's not true. So I think that movies, as long as they're not offensive, as long as they don't cross certain moral boundaries, the fact that they may have theological untruths, it gives us an opportunity to use that comparison. But were there any in this series? Now, you probably wouldn't have included them here, but did you discover some where you're like, no, you know what? There's actually more negative than positive that can come out of that movie going experience, right? I imagine that not every movie that would fall into a genre you could have put in this book would have been the kind of movie you still want to take your kids to, because maybe it has something that's more offensive.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. Some of the more anti-hero flavored movies. If you know what an anti-hero is, it's generally someone who is much more morally ambiguous than a true hero, if you will. So Deadpool, as an example, is not really an anti-hero, but you know, the movie is not nearly as serious. Has very few positive examples. He's kind of a wisecrack, vulgar. Stuff like that. And again, not to say that there aren't good themes in Deadpool if you see it, but that's much closer to where we're going to kind of draw the line, and particularly when there's kids involved, start to say, okay, well, you know, the juice isn't worth the squeeze out of this. You could get this lesson, you know, minus all the cursing and nudities somewhere else.
Okay. So let's just capitalize, and we'll finish on that word you just mentioned, Zach. This idea, this is what's in the title of the book. It's about heroes. That a lot of these are really superheroes, and only in a stretch, right? They are so morally ambiguous. But the ones you've got in the book, these are all superheroes, and we are obsessed from a literary perspective, it seems like, with heroes, and that's what ultimately leads us back to the ultimate hero. Now, you talked about how a lot of these characters had this aspect of sacrifice in common. Was that also the one thing that you saw that united them to the Jesus story?
I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. Obviously, from a genre, that's really kind of the thing that ties all heroes together. The idea that they're willing to sacrifice for the greater good in almost all cases. But there's way more to it than that, right? The upright moral behavior that we see from most superheroes. The idea that they keep going back to not only a sacrifice, but a sacrifice that we don't expect, or at a scale that is huge, right? So the idea that Iron Man sacrifices himself and then saves not only the world, but the universe, but then also they do it for people that they've never even met, right? It's easy. You know, I think we said this example in the book. It's easy to sacrifice yourself for your friends,
right? But
it's harder to sacrifice yourself for someone you've never met. And then the hardest of all is to sacrifice yourself for your enemy, which is really how we tie it together at the end. Is, okay, well, even most superheroes won't even do that, but Jesus does. He's praying for him on the cross.
So is this the way then that the elevated story, because there is an aspect of this where, you know, not every superhero you would say is morally equivalent. You'd say that some are, there's just but Jesus stands head and shoulders above all of them.
That's the final chapter.
Yes. And although all of these point to at least they ghost, or they point in the rough outline. So what is it about Jesus then that once you're kind of teased with the goodness of superheroes, and you've got an appetite for what superheroes represent, what is it about Jesus that raises the bar and satisfies that appetite?
Well, one of the things, I mean, we go through about 9 different things how Jesus is better than, and obviously perfect. He's the perfect superhero that can't be created in fiction or nonfiction. This is not a created story. This is, well, when I say nonfiction, Jesus is nonfiction, but I mean, there's nobody else in nonfiction, I should say. And here's just one idea that I'd like to communicate about Jesus that we discovered in writing this book. And that is, think about the fact that Jesus never pushes a good trait so far that it becomes a bad trait. Like, for example, Captain America is super righteous, but that can be pushed into hair-splitting pride, where he is just, wanting to be right all the time, that he's annoyingly right. You're just frustrated with him. Or Tony Stark, he wants to be in charge, but sometimes he can go too far and basically roll over the rights of other people. It's good to want to take the lead, but he's not holding that intention. And if you look at Jesus, there are aspects of Jesus that you can't find in any character in fiction or nonfiction. For example, he's full of truth, but he's also full of grace. And I know I probably go too far on the truth side, and therefore some people won't listen to me because I don't have enough grace. Jesus is full of holiness, but he's also approachable. Most people who are too full of holiness are unapproachable. Jesus is strong, but he's also tender. He's confident, but he's also humble. He's completely mission focused, but he's also loving. I can't think of hardly anybody that holds one of those two opposed characteristics in tension. Jesus holds them all in tension. There's something special about Jesus.
So would you say then, guys, that these books, and these movies rather, are really a catalyst? They ought to catalyze us to be looking for their completion. They ought to make us want. Again, we restarted again, and when we restarted, we talked about Lewis. If there's this desire in your heart that cannot be satisfied in movies, and it cannot be satisfied in any portrayal of any character here in our lifetime, is it not pointing us to the one ultimate hero that does satisfy? All these things we have a tendency to trickle out in our movies and in our conversations, but it turns out it's best satisfied in the God-man, Jesus. So where can people find more information? I know that we've talked a little bit about some opportunities. You'll be on lots of interviews, I'm sure, over the next couple of months. But where can people go if they just want to they want to learn more about how to get the book, what the book's really about, maybe even get sample chapters, all that kind of stuff that you guys are offering? Where can they go?
Yeah, HollywoodHeroesBook.com. In fact, it's in the ticker, HollywoodHeroesBook.com. And I think Jorge's going to come with his voice anyway. He's going to come on and tell us about another opportunity, because Zach and I are doing some Zoom meetings that people can be a part of. It's kind of a book club. Jorge, you there?
I am, Frank. So
there he is.
This is what I'm going to teach the people here on the stream. And what they need to do is they need to get a copy of the book. Go ahead on to HollywoodHeroesBook.com. You can go here, and well, not here. That's the other place. So you go here, you get to the book, and then you go to community.crossexamine.org /book launch. And that's going to be in the description of this stream, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube. Now, if you're watching it on Twitter, or if you're watching it on Instagram, you cannot obviously go to the description because there's no description. But if you go to Facebook or on YouTube, you go to the link community.crossexamine.org /book launch, and you fill out this form and you put your order confirmation, and you're going to be able to go into this private group, and then you're going to be able to interact with Zach and with Frank on a couple of, I think it's Bible studies. Frank, is that what you're going to do? Book.
Yeah, we got 3 Zoom sessions coming up. Okay. So we're going to talk to people and take questions and comments and interact a little bit. So if they want to be a part of that, just go to HollywoodHeroesBook.com, follow the cues there, and look in the description of this video.
Yeah.
for those links.
So our team is going to put this on the chat right now as well. So you can save that link. And after you buy the book, you just go there and you put your book order confirmation, and we let you into this group. And then you can hang out with Zach and with Frank.
Hey, Jorge, come back on for a second, because I want Zach to evaluate what character in Star Wars you look like right now. What are those little kind of short little things that kept poking?
He did say that earlier. Yeah.
What are those, Zach? What are those short little things that keep poking? Was it Luke, or who did they keep poking?
Listen,
what are those things?
Are you talking about?
Are you talking about Baby Yoda?
Not
No.
Baby Yoda.
No. What I look like, but he's just jealous of my white glass
he
frame
wants-
swag,
he
man.
wants-
He's just jealous of my swag.
get
That's
him
all it
outta
is,
here.
man.
What are those characters, Zach?
Talking
You know
about
who they are.
The Porgs? Is that what this
No,
is?
he's talking about from the first trilogy.
The
It's
first
in
trilogy.
the last. It's in
I'm
the last movie.
playing dumb here.
Okay, guy, who does he look like? Come on now, tell us who it is.
Come on, look at this great profile right here, baby.
By the way,
Oh.
look at all the background. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Seriously. I mean, if you, I hate to even imagine what the next book you're going to write is going to be, because it's going to have to be in Jorge's background.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Well, listen, guys, it was great to get a chance to talk about the book. I know it's going to, I think, be super valuable on a number of interesting levels. It seems like we're kind of moving into some creative territory on what we can do from making a case for Christianity in creative ways. And I think this is one of those books that will be, number one, fun to read. It's a fun read. It's a quick read. It's also a very insightful read. And I can kind of just tell, I mean, not so much, sorry, Frank, not so much from you, but from Zach.
That's right.
Like, this guy knows his movies, and he's already looking.
That's right.
for
He knows the
deeper
movies,
themes.
man. Look at that.
Oh, there we go. Jeez, here we go. All right. Thank you for cutting that off. So that's good. So I think that part about it, I think, was intriguing also. And so I just know for people who are interested in seeing those parallels and actually starting conversations about those parallels, because you're right. I mean, this is almost everyone will go to see these movies. My son Jimmy is a huge comic book, fan, and has seen all of these movies. And this is the one set of movies that even now, at my age and at his age, we still go together to see. So I think these are conversation starters. So I hope this book, Hollywood Heroes, will help you to start those conversations with the people in your life. And you can get that at HollywoodHeroesBook.com. All right. And that is it for this week of our Hope One show. Thank you, Frank, for letting me host it.
Thanks for hosting,
I appreciate it. Yep. I'm glad to do it. And Zach, I hope to get up to see you. You're still pretty far away, but I'm closer to you than your dad is geographically. So I hope to get
That's
to see
right.
you
You're
soon.
welcome
That's
up
right.
here anytime.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining our show, and we'll see you back here soon.
Thanks, guys. See you.
Thanks.